Welcome to another episode of the Phoenix Rising podcast. I am your host, Lisa Hillier, and I am so grateful that you have joined me for another episode on the show, where it often feels like I am learning and healing out loud, gathering interests and people that inspire me to grow and expand and heal. And today I have Kate Kavanaugh with me on the show. And I came across Kate's podcast, Mind, Body, Soil, a few months ago. And as I have attuned to a slower pace of life, I have increasingly over the years become very interested in soil, in farmers, in food, in anchoring deeply into a more ancestral way of living and with being with all things on the planet. And so I quickly became obsessed with Kate's podcast. And so I am so excited to have her on the show with me. She is a wealth of knowledge and speaks so poetically, where you just want to sink into the soil, into the mycelium, into the roots, and really experience that interconnectedness of life for yourself. And so Kate started her journey in regenerative agriculture 15 years ago by looking at how meat could be a byproduct of conservation, supporting the intersection of land and human health. Kate opened up grocery and butcher shop Western Daughters in Denver, Colorado in 2013, becoming a holistic nutritionist along the way. Now, Kate is the host of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where she's devoted to digging in deep with guests, finding the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. In her spare time, Kate raises goats, pigs, cows, and poultry on a small farm in upstate New York. And I am so excited to dive into this conversation with you. It is a beautiful co-creation that wove and thread into so many of the integral areas of what it means to be a human on this planet at this time. And if you love this episode, I ask that you please share it, that you write a review, give us a 5-star rating. It helps so much for these conversations to get out to a wider audience, and it's a way to be in reciprocity with the podcast, with this work that we're creating at this time. And if you feel called to make a financial contribution, please consider joining my Patreon portal. And thank you so much. And here is the episode. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Phoenix Rising podcast. And I am here with Kate Kavanaugh, and I'm so excited for this conversation. I think it's such a weird time in the world, or maybe it's a really powerful, we're going to call it that. It's a powerful time in the world because it feels like there's such a call to more simplicity, slower pace living, or maybe I'm just getting older. I don't know.
I like that question. Maybe it's just that we're getting older. I think it can be both.
Both. I like
right?
both. Yeah.
I think it can be both.
Both feels good. And, on my journey, I was living in cities. I was vegetarian. I was all these, kind of that go, go, go lifestyle. And now there's just this call for simplicity and slowing down and living off the land and eating meat and all that good stuff. So I was called to your podcast, I think by Rome Ranch, and have just loved learning about food and the simplicity and like the wholeness of it and where it comes from and how we can eat more of the good stuff and farmers and soil and all of that magic. And so I love the part in your journey where you have gone from being a vegetarian to a butcher Those are two extremes right
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's start there. What was the call to vegetarianism? And then what eventually led you to become a butcher?
Yeah. I think they feel like two extremes, and in many ways, they're two sides of the same coin, at least when I look at them through hindsight, which is everything. I felt a call to be a vegetarian as a very small child, and I was 5 years old and had an acute experience of death in my childhood. There was a lot of death. And I think, like many people, adults and children both, I wanted to avoid death. It felt painful. And the one way I felt that I could control this was through the choices around my food. And I decided to become a vegetarian, and my parents indulged me, which maybe they shouldn't have. And this continued for 15 years. And I think at the heart of that very young decision was both an avoidance of death and a desire in many ways to be disconnected. Like everything in my life felt so hectic, so chaotic and so disconnected that that is part of where that decision came from, was this deep disconnection. And when I was in my late teens and 20s, I started experiencing some health issues and felt a call to begin to eat meat again. A call, a craving, however you want to describe that, and wanted to go as close as I could. And so, in many ways, what was a symptom of my disconnection or an avoidance, I wanted to go directly into connection. I sought out farmers and ranchers. I wanted to know the hands and the people that were raising my food. I wanted to experience the soil and the ecosystems where my food was coming from firsthand to better understand them, and found this door to a whole world of what we call our food system. I'm not so sure it's a system right now, and wanted to do a deep dive and felt this desire to continue to deepen that connection. And that took me into learning how to butcher and opening a butcher shop and pursuing a certification in nutrition and getting my own farm and processing all of the meat that I eat. And so each step just felt like I was getting deeper and deeper and deeper towards that sense of connecting as closely as possible as I could, both to place and to my food through that.
I love that connection to the food, like that deep connection to the food. And I think that's a big part of what's been lost on the planet, and what there's a big return to is that connection to food. Just speaking to my own journey of being vegetarian, kind of vegetarian / vegan. I was vegan for most of it. And I as well felt that call to bone broth. And now there's like this deep call to know the farmer, to know where my meat's coming from, that connection to it, as opposed to just picking up this stuff in the supermarket that who knows where it's coming from. For you, what does it feel like created that disconnect from our food? Because when you think about it, like food's pretty important, but a lot of us aren't connected to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that disconnect has deep origins. I think for the majority of our time here on Earth as Homo sapiens, we have been very intimately connected to our food. And it comprised most of our day, right? To hunt, to gather, to process our food, and more importantly, to do this in community and to sit around a campfire and consume that food together, to share story in the consumption of that food as a nutrient, just as important as anything that you're going to find in the food, is our birthright, and I think how things were for many, many millennia. And I think that disconnection begins to really take root as we get pushed into agriculture 12,500 years ago from a sort of change in climate. And we began to become rooted in place, and we fundamentally shift our relationship with food into something that becomes more of a hierarchy, more of a system of control. And I think that this gets echoed in these little fractures throughout history. We see it again at the scientific revolution and the idea of sort of degrading everything into parts instead of looking at the whole. Through Newtonian mechanics. And I think, again, through the Industrial Revolution, where we have this idea of the machine and everything functioning in this sort of growth and perpetuity towards what we define as progress. And I think that that shapes, too, our worldview, right? We move from viewing the cycles of nature as the template for our psyche into having this sort of linear path, this race to who knows where. And these disconnections run deep. And I think we're inculcated in them, that this is a part of our societal and cultural milieu, and the sort of passing down of, I think, in many ways, intergenerational trauma just from that disconnection of food and certainly of community as well. And so I think it was similar for me. And then I think, on an individual level, there was this story of fear in my childhood, of feeling isolated and feeling other, and this experience of death that I wanted to turn away from. And there's a kind of root of disconnection there. And I think that in some ways it's beautiful because it can serve as a jumping off point for finding connection.
Yeah, what I really receive from that is this disconnection that we're feeling on the planet from our food, from community, from each other, can be like a jumping off point to really start to reconnect and find that interconnectedness between all things. I listened to your talk from Rome Ranch. What was it called? Hope.
Everything happens in relationship.
Yes. And I loved the story of the, you're going to have to help me here, the thing on the bison. What was on the bison?
Seed.
The seed. Okay.
Yeah.
And just how it travels and it goes through all these stages and all these different things to become this beautiful plant at the end. Is that correct? But it goes through all these things in relationship to get to that place.
Yeah. So it goes through all of these different stages of interactions with other beings to eventually become a part of us. And so it traverses this transformation of matter, from, bees and insects alighting on this little seed and conferring some of their microbiome, and to the ecosystem of a bison and into the soil food web, and these relationships that happen at every step of the way.
Yeah, that interconnectedness, and just some words that you spoke of in that talk that stood out so potently was we're not a being and a universe. We're a universe and a being, and that interconnectedness that runs through all of us, and that being in community and eating in community. And I think of our ancestors and slowing down. Like, what's changed so much is we're so on fast forward, in a sense, like so busy. There isn't that time to sit down and connect. I remember, childhood, it was oftentimes in front of the TV dinners, eating meals, that kind of stuff. And so that speeding up didn't allow for a beautiful meal to be shared in community. And that is part of the nutritional aspect of food, is who you're eating it with, and who you're breaking bread with, and who you're communing with just as much.
Yes,
as
and
the
even
actual food itself.
The state of your nervous system while you're eating it, right? To be in that parasympathetic state where you are grounded and connected changes the way that you digest that food. To be in a slowed down state, not to be rushing from one place to the next, but to drop into presence. And I know that in my own search to slow down, I often see this mentored to me through my goats when they lay in the sun and chew their cud and slow down completely and just seem to melt into a different plane, that there is just a oneness to them in those moments, with everything a suchness to them as they chew their cud. And I think that we are capable of holding that space, but I agree completely. We're just in a very frenetic and rushed environment.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the gifts of COVID,
Mm,
was the slowing down for me
yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
It was just to slow down and reconnect
I
in
love that.
isolation in some ways, but then we found a way with that, or some of us did, where we could stay connected in the slower
Yeah.
pace.
Yeah, and I think, like anything else, like disconnection can highlight our ability to connect or lead us back to a space of seeking connection. So does isolation, right? Those
Mm-hmm.
times of isolation driving us to connect in a different way. That we are we are humans that love to hold opposites, that love to hold sort of competing and polarities, and to find the continuous thread within those polarities.
Yeah. Experiencing one extreme can allow us to experience the other, for sure.
And then to come back into a
Come
state
back
of balance.
into the middle, coming it
Mm.
back into the middle. What would you say for people listening as a way, kind of a beginner's point, to start to reconnect to the
Mm.
food, to their food?
Yeah. I think that the beginner's point is to reach out to a farmer or to a rancher, right? This could be a vegetable grower that's just in an urban environment, like a little micro farm, or this could be a rancher that's an hour outside of wherever you live, or maybe you live in a rural environment and they're closer. But I think that this gives us two opportunities. It gives us an opportunity to connect with people and to the community of hands that are growing our food. And it gives us an opportunity to connect to place, where our food comes from, and to see that in situ and feel a little bit more connected in that.
Yeah, you just saw my dog run down the
I
stairs, didn't you?
loved it. I
Yeah.
loved seeing this little visitor come.
He always comes bolting down at the randomest moments. So yeah, I love that, connecting with the farmer or whoever, the vegetable. What
Yeah.
I absolutely love about where I live is there's farm stands everywhere. They're on
Mm.
an honor system, and so you go to these people's gardens and get their produce. And I know that's not available everywhere, but it's such a gift to connect with people in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, it's amazing. And to see the place where your food is coming from, like that we are a part of that ecosystem, whether we're engaging with it, or not, that we are rooted in that place and where our food is being grown.
Yeah, so beautiful. So, with vegetarianism, what were the mental health? Not
Hmm.
mental. I struggled with mental health
So did I.
from being a vegetarian. What were the health issues that came up for you around it?
Oh, I mean, this is a deep subject, and I mean, it spans many things. And I think that, yeah. One thing I like to remind people is that we are incredibly bio-individual, right? That
Mm,
we are a constellation of experiences and inputs that bring us to the space where our health is in any given moment. And so it's never just a place of coming from vegetarianism. It is also what we ate in childhood, what we experienced in childhood, the places we've lived, the environments that we're interacting with. And when I came to the space of wanting to eat meat again, I was experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, which wasn't new. That was sort of the state of my existence throughout childhood, and was a complex place, right? Of the home life that I was experiencing and the diet that I ate, it was both and. Um, Lots of anxiety, lots of depression, lots of gastrointestinal issues, just unending fatigue. And as I come into turning about 35, I realize now that I have never felt this well in my whole life, right? The state of health that I have found, that I've been seeking over the last 15 years since I first ate that bite of meat, is this right here in this moment. And so it was a constellation of issues: gastrointestinal, mood, lethargy, and probably a host of other things too that I couldn't even see, some hormonal issues.
Yeah, I think that's important, is that it's a constellation of things. It's not just one thing. My perfect storm, that's what my naturopath called it. That part of
Yes.
it was because of being vegetarian, because it led me into early menopause
Hmm.
at 41.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was a perfect storm that
Yeah.
led to, severe anxiety and all kinds of things at
Yeah.
once.
That's a beautiful way of putting it, too. Like, it's a perfect storm. And I think that one of the reasons I like to remind people that it's many things is because it's also many things that brings us out of that storm. That there
Yeah.
is no one size fits all, there is no one pill cure all, that it is a constellation that has brought us to this place, and it is a constellation that brings us out of that place as well.
Yeah. You have to look at it spiritually, physically,
Yes.
mentally, all kinds of
Yes.
looking at it at all these different angles allows for that healing to really
Mm-hmm.
take place. Yeah. Lyme's disease, that's been part of your journey.
Mm-hmm.
What did the healing from that look like? Or is it something that you've integrated,
This is hard to say, and I think it's hard to say whether this was really the sole cause. I traversed a long journey of trying to find a diagnosis. Started to feel a lot better after I began eating meat again, and then I opened up a butcher shop in Denver, Colorado, called Western Daughters, and experienced a deep amount of burnout. I turned to alcohol and drugs. It was very stressful for me. And when I came out of that place, I was even more depleted, I think, than I had ever been, and got sicker than I had ever been, starting at around age 28, 29, and leading me to a place where I could not even get out of bed, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And I really looked for a diagnosis. And I think now, in retrospect, Lyme may or may not have played a role. But there was a constellation again of
Mhm.
things that were happening, and some of it was, I think, deep nutrient depletion, dating all the way back to childhood, maybe dating all the way back to what I didn't get in utero, and just the sort of way we pass down nutrient deficiencies throughout the generations. And I have autoimmune atrophic gastritis. So I have an inability to produce B12, or intrinsic factor, the binding protein that shuttles B12 into cells. And so it's actually interesting that I would come to eating meat, which is so rich in B12, and it sort of staved off the worst parts of this illness for a long time until it became really bad. And then, some confounding factors that may or may not have been Lyme disease. And I came out of this really looking at that constellation, right? Like, how can my food, how can my relationships in life, how can my interaction with the place that I live, with the way that I move my body, with the way that I understand my brain, how can all of these things work together with food, and occasionally with things like supplements, with these other levers, in order to bring me to a space of health again.
Mm.
And it took a long time to find that. And when I this last year, I have experienced just healing in leaps and bounds that I never imagined possible.
Mm. Is there one core piece that surprised you that has led to deep healing?
Yeah, there is. I actually think it was starting the podcast, and this is gonna sound kind of funny, but this had been a dream of mine for many years, and I had made a lot of excuses for why I wasn't ready for that dream, why I wasn't enough for that dream. I wasn't smart enough. I was too anxious and, wasn't calm enough. I didn't know enough. I was, too socially inept to do this and kept looking for these excuses. And I had held it in my heart for 5 years. And I actually believe that we think of our dreams as these really sparkly beacons of light guiding us, but this dream had turned into something that was rotting inside of me. And through the action of doing it, I feel that there was a lot of healing and also a lot of surrendering and letting go of something that needed to be let go of and allow me to grow into a different space.
I love that, the rotting inside of you, because that can happen sometimes where it's like God is just pushing you, like you need to birth this, and it can turn into that rotting space so that you birth it into the world.
We're holding on to something, right? It's eating away at our insides. It's a constant gnawing and nagging, and to allow that to come into the world instead as a creative force is, just like you said, it's an act of birthing something into the world. And I think too, it's an act of letting a different part of ourselves die.
Yeah. Was there a part of you that died? There was a part of you that died.
Oh, over and over and over again, right? Like so many descents into allowing ideas of myself to die, allowing versions of myself to die, of different dreams to die so that this one could come through. I think that we are constantly shifting and changing and have an opportunity to sort of hold these funerals for what we have been. And yes, a lot of death.
A lot of death. The podcast was extremely healing for me as well. It was not something that I anticipated. It was like this whisper on a Scorpio new moon, start a podcast, and I just did it. And it was during a really deep grief time in my life, and also going through huge hormonal changes that I didn't know I was going through.
Yeah.
And it became so healing just to have these conversations and to connect in a different way. So I love that. What do you wish people knew about podcasting that they don't know?
About podcasting as a whole, or about my process in general?
I think as a whole, it looks like this, oh, you have a podcast show, like it's so amazing. And, it has a lifestyle or an identity that goes with it. And sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes that is the case, but there are different things that I think that people don't see on the outside with podcasting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think at its core that we as humans are storytellers. And I think that we lean into story, into mythology to describe the parts of the world that are so hard for us to put into language. And I think that this gives us a sense of connection to one another and also to something bigger and something more mysterious. And I think that podcasting is in many ways a place that we've come to create a campfire in the now, right? This is our modern campfire. But I think that within that is that a lot of work can go into telling a story, a lot of experience. I think in the case of podcasting, a lot of research. I know that for myself, I do a lot of background on guests in order to bring forth something deeper. And that this is work, number one, that this is a creative work, and requires background and reading and technical pieces and all of these different things that you're doing to put it out there, but also that there is an art to this, that there is an art to interviewing, that there is a creative force behind podcasting. And I think many of us, and am sure you are one of these people, that there is a greater story that we are telling, that it over these common threads that run through all the guests. I sometimes liken this to the idea that I'm putting together a puzzle, and I can't fully see exactly what the picture is, but I can feel when people have some pieces of that puzzle. And this is something that I am bringing into the world as an act of creation.
I said in my stories on Instagram the other day, because have you ever gone back and listened to your first episodes on the podcast?
No.
I haven't yet, but I'm like, I can't imagine how much they've shifted and changed. And it's like I'm learning and healing out loud. And it's creating this tapestry is what I really received of this bigger web of, your life, my life, but far greater than that. It like the interconnectedness of the mycelium and the roots and all of that is created with this podcast, with your podcast. It's a creation. It's an art.
I love that. And I love the imagery of weaving a tapestry. I often say of my podcast that I'm exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth, because I think that there is this tapestry and interwovenness of beingness that we're exploring, that you're exploring. And there is so much healing in it. And I say this often on my intros, but every single guest changes the trajectory of my life. And I am amazed at the power of that to happen. Just how transformative this act of sharing story can be.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that really caused a stirring in me was one of your intros where you asked for reciprocity and a Patreon portal, Substack. And I know it's like you get so uncomfortable, right? Because it's like speaking about money and podcasting. But I think that that's something that people don't realize is the time that goes into podcasting for really, there's not a reciprocity there. Does that, and when you said about your Patreon portal, I was like, I will join Kate's Patreon portal because I receive so much from your podcast episodes. And so I think that's something that people don't realize with podcasting is that we're putting our heart and soul literally out there for not a lot of return.
No. And
I mean,
I think
fills
people
the
think
soul.
it does. Yes. I mean, this fills my cup immensely. And we have to operate within a paradigm that requires money for us to operate in. And this is where the majority of my time and work is spent.
Yeah.
And I think that there's this idea that it just takes a couple of hours a week, when in fact it takes much, much more than that. Yeah. And so this is preventing my ability to go do other work. And again, that's a choice too, right? Like, this is my choice to lean into this. And I think to ask for the idea of reciprocity, or what Charles Eisenstein would call living in the gift, that we give these gifts to one another in order to grow our greater community. And, there are times when I think podcasting feels like speaking into the void, that you're just kind of talking into the nothingness. And I was reminded really sweetly last night from someone that I don't see very often that listens to the podcast, that there are also silent people out there that, while they may not be responding, are in that act of receiving. And I think that we are receiving something from that level of reciprocity. It just might be a little bit more hidden.
Yeah. It's like the people that are watching are usually the silent ones that you don't even know about. And it's an art, and to ask for reciprocity, I think, is challenging because we don't want to ask for, to receive with our soul's work, because we do it whether we received anything. But I think it's really courageous to put it out there.
Thank
and
you.
to just say,
yeah. I mean, it made me nauseous. And I think that this speaks to other wounds, right? And I know that this has come up for me a lot lately, is a struggle to receive. And when I do receive, feeling a resistance to hear a compliment, to receive money for my work, to, receive an opportunity. And it asks us to find those spaces in us where we still don't feel worthy, and to begin to adjust that so we can receive as much as we give.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's a big learning lesson in receiving and allowing.
It's a big lesson. That's one of my big lessons right now.
Yeah, and to ask for what is actually required. It's a big one.
Yes.
With that, like regenerative farming and farming, the two are very different. Could you touch on the differences between regenerative farming and regular farming? And also, just something that's coming forward is another episode that I listened to, and of yours, and it was about collagen supplements. Totally random that I'm bringing this up, but I was using collagen in my smoothies every day. My dog's going a little bit crazy. I don't know if you can hear him in the background.
It's totally fine.
And when you spoke about that, and just it created a light bulb where I was like, oh, it is bleached and it's deodorized, and I'm supporting some big corporation by purchasing my collagen. And I've never bought collagen since then. I found other ways to get collagen in my smoothie, but it was something that I never ever thought about. And I think supporting our farmers is so important, but those are little ways that we don't think about how we're supporting big corporations and not farmers. So
let's talk about both of those things. I'll see if I can weave them together too.
Okay, yeah.
I think to kind of carry on where we've been in this conversation, we can think of regenerative farming as an act of reciprocity, that there is a loop cyclical system between land steward, between animals, between the soil. And this is very much what that talk, Everything Happens in Relationship, is about, is being a steward of this space. That we are taking the template that nature has given us, that, is wrought over thousands of years of coevolution and of codependence and interbeingness that happens in ecosystems. And this is really well illustrated when you think about bison and grasslands, that these grasslands, this massive organism with an incredible ability to sequester carbon, to absorb water, to cycle nutrients through the soil, is nourished by bison pressing seeds into it with their perfect shovel-like hooves and adding back fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and microbes in their urine and in their manure, and to add a little bit of positive stress when they take one or two bites of a plant and strengthen that root system. And they also press dead matter back into the soil so that it can be cycled through. And in return, those grasses are deeply nourishing this ruminant, this bison that is wandering throughout the plains. They are giving it minerals from inside the soil that are liberated from mycorrhizal fungi, using organic acids on rocks that are just stardust compressed throughout deep time. And there is this reciprocity within that cycle. And so regenerative agriculture is looking at that template and saying, well, there's some guardrails and some limitations that are here now. How can I work within that context and within the context of my incredibly individual ecosystem that is influenced by a constellation of things, just like your and my health and those places that we come to? And how can I become an observer of those constellations of interactions, and then become a participant in the way that I steward this land? And I think that this is very different than what I would call a more conventional model of agriculture, where you are really looking at the bottom line. You're looking at efficiency, you're looking at yields, and you're looking at really reducing things down to a mechanization of parts. And so, I mean, the opposite of moving a cow through different pastures, kind of imitating that bison, would be to have it in one place where you feed it corn and soy grown from all over the world using pesticides and herbicides in a concentrated animal feeding operation. And so, one side, you have a lot of biodiversity, a lot of relationships, a lot of reciprocity. And on the other, you have a monoculture, a monolith, and isolation. And so those are kind of those two paths. And I think that we see this mirrored again in our food system with these sort of hyper processed foods, even the ones that we don't realize are hyper processed, like collagen, where you have really isolated and taken something out of its context, right? We find collagen in the connective tissue of animals. And so this is going to be in their tendons and ligaments and skin and fascia and the coverings of bones, of cartilage. And we're taking that and we're reducing it to this part through this chemical processing where it's deodorized and anti-caking agents are applied and all of these different things. So we're taking it again in isolation. But when collagen is in situ, in whether it's ground beef or bones in bone broth or a slow roasted cut of meat, that collagen is going to be working in concert with everything that is there in that animal and having so much more than just an isolated product.
Yeah, it's that interconnectedness is what really spoke there with the regenerative, and also like a relationship to the meat, to the animal, to get the collagen, as opposed to it going through all this different processing, and only God knows what it goes through to get into this container. Same with big scale farms, what the animals go through to get into the grocery stores and all of that. What are some main sources of collagen from a meat standpoint?
Yeah, so I love this. And I want to mention here that, there's a gentleman named James Oshman that called collagen the living matrix, that this runs throughout our entire body and is a big part of the connectivity that we experience. It structures water inside of our body and sort of makes that living crystal that you'll hear people talk about. And it's part of the connectivity of electron flow in our body and is really incredible. And you find collagen, which is predominantly composed of the amino acid glycine, in connective tissue. And so this is ligaments, tendons, the cartilaginous covering around bones or in between vertebrae on discs, or anything that we perceive as this sort of toughness in muscle meat. And my favorite sources for this, bone broth, ground beef, which is actually my favorite, less talked about source of collagen. That this is tougher cuts of meat that are being mechanically broken down so that we don't perceive them as tough. And it has a really good ratio of methionine, which is the amino acid in lean muscle meat, and glycine, which is collagen. Braising cuts, shanks are going to be an especially awesome source of collagen because they have all of this connective tissue inside of them. Anything that's going to get that sort of unctuous breakdown. But even something like a pork cracklin or the skin is going to have a lot of collagen as well, and any bones and those coverings that go into bone broth.
You spoke beautifully to it in many ways already, is that how animals play a part in restoring landscape. And I think that's an important conversation right now. Just in the world, I think we're seeing a lot around climate change and animals being the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that was part of the reason why I became vegetarian was, because animals are part of the problem. And you can watch so many documentaries on it. And, you can also watch so many documentaries that say the other side as
Yes.
well. And so how do animals restore landscapes? When
Yeah.
you were speaking about the bison and that, yeah, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so let's come back to that bison while we talk about this a little bit. And I think, first of all, one of the things I want to say is about 40% of the land the world over is not suitable for growing crops, that it is predominantly it's too rocky, it's too arid, it can't be tilled. And these are areas where animals thrive. And so, to come back to our ruminant and grassland connection, because so many of these spaces, that 40%, are grasslands, that these grasslands and ruminants like bison, like African antelopes and springbok and all of these things, or in Australia, you see things like the kangaroo. Here, you also see pronghorn and elk and deer, domestic species, cattle, goats, sheep are all going to be ruminants. You have this unique relationship where there is a reciprocity and a co-evolution. But what's happening too is that that grass is a part of all these cycles that we see in news headlines. And so we often see carbon emissions attributed to animals. And you see a lot of different figures for this. And you also see methane emissions. Sometimes you see stuff about nitrogen, less so about the nutrient cycle or the water cycle. And I think this gives this idea that there is, again, just one thing, right? We're reducing everything to just one element. We are isolating carbon, which is part of a lot of different cycles that happen within nature. And carbon is something that grasslands and plants sequester, right? So they take carbon dioxide and use it and then put it inside the soil, and the soil uses carbon as an exchange to give those plants minerals and different nutrients in the soil food web, and then it stores carbon inside of the soil. And so there's this beautiful, again, reciprocal relationship that's happening between plants and photosynthesis and pulling carbon and nitrogen as well out of the atmosphere and fixing it inside of the soil. And we see carbon emissions numbers oftentimes about livestock. Many of these are an 18% number, that livestock account for 18% of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And this came out of a study that actually retracted that number, called Livestock's Long Shadow, in, I think, 2008, and is still cited. I think that more accurate things look at about 2% of emissions coming from livestock in the United States, maybe as much as 5% globally. But we've just kind of focused on this one player. We look at cows being the problem. And I think that this too is fascinating, right? We don't talk about the military industrial complex when we talk about carbon emissions. We don't talk about the fact that there are maybe 100 million cows in the United States, and that's probably a high estimate, but there are over 200 million cars, all the different ways that carbon happens. But it's also, again, part of this cycle that animals can help restore, right? They can help restore the ability of the structures inside of our soil to be able to once again sequester that carbon, because they're building healthy plants with healthy roots and healthy microbes inside the soil, where you have 1 billion microorganisms per single teaspoon of soil. But if you have a monocrop of peas, where you're going to make pea protein isolate to make a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger or these protein powders, whatever it is, right? You have this single crop. You don't have any biodiversity. Oftentimes, you're spraying herbicides and pesticides that are destroying those microorganisms that are inside the soil. You are breaking the soil's ability to absorb water and to truly sequester carbon. And you're also experiencing massive amounts of topsoil erosion. And so 20 billion tons of topsoil in the United States that just rolls away because there are no grasses, no perennial plant matter to hold it down. And so animals can play this role in bringing us back into that more natural state of homeostasis and reciprocity between animals and ecosystems.
Yeah, that's really important to look at. Is we think we're making the better choice, or at least I thought I was making the better choice by having one of those Beyond Meat burgers than just eating a packet of ground beef, which...
Well, and we're being sold that. And I think that this is really important because I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, well, I really thought that. And of course you did, because you are being sold that this is a better alternative by corporations that have massive marketing budgets to push that this is a greener, cleaner, healthier alternative to meat. But I think that, too, one of the things that we don't look at is, so it goes beyond the agriculture that's going in, the monocrops that are going into that burger. And it's also the factories. And so how much mining of iron ore happened to make all of that machinery? How much fossil fuels are we pulling up and using as plastics in that system? And so it's not just the food stuff itself and all of the processing that happens, and then all of the packaging that happens. And all of this really goes to serve and be a part of the bottom line for a corporation. And you see this, the biggest investors in alternative meat are the biggest players in the big meat industry. Cargill, JBS Swift are the biggest investors in these alternative meat products. And so I think it's really about lining pockets more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's important. What you said is that we're being sold these ideas and coming back to collagen, because it can feel like, oh gosh, I'm doing another frickin' thing wrong. I'm putting collagen in my smoothie, and I just want to emphasize that for people, that it can feel like that, but that's not the intent. Is just bringing awareness to these different areas that we don't really think about, that we're being sold.
Yes. And I also like, there are going to be places where we need convenience, where we need ease, and where we are inextricably bound to some of these systems. And I think we all have spaces of this. And I think the last thing that I want to do is to sell an idea of utopian perfection in the way that every aspect of our lives is sourced. I don't think that exists. And so I just want to give people the space that sometimes we need ease and sometimes we need convenience, and that the onus is not on us as individuals to change everything.
Yeah. I think that's important. And when I heard that in the podcast episode, I think it was with Katie from Rome Ranch.
Yeah.
It was such a great episode. It just brought awareness. And I was like, I can change that. I cannot use collagen anymore. I can get it from, now I eat ground beef all the time, and it's so delicious.
Yeah.
You
and
feel
nourishing.
the nourishment
coming
from it.
And there's more going on. And one thing that I like to point to for people is that we often get stuck in, again, isolating these constituent elements of our food, that things are just fat and protein and carbs. But really, there are also all of these trace minerals and vitamins in our food. And there's another layer beyond that, which Dr. Stefan Van Vliet calls the dark matter of nutrition, these secondary compounds and phytonutrients that we generally associate with fruits and things like anthocyanins or terpenes or carotenoids. And these are in our meat too, this entire realm of nutrients that we are only beginning to understand. And so whenever it's possible, and again, there's no shame in this, whenever it's possible, I like to receive as much nutrition as I can from whole foods in their whole form, as opposed to in an isolated powder or elixir.
Yeah. Yeah. That's powerful to just look at it that way. How can I get a whole food, not something that's gone through multiple steps to get to
Yeah.
me? What are some questions that come to mind to ask your farmer, to get to know your farmer, to, yeah, create that connection with the food?
I want to turn this on its head a little bit. I think that this is a question we ask oftentimes, and I want to propose something a little bit different. I think one of the best questions you can ask your farmer is, what can I do to support you? Is there any way that I can help you if you have the time to do so? I think that we have a food monolith, a little bit less a system, a little bit more of a monolith. A system implies a sense of interbeingness and interconnections and interdependence. And there isn't a lot of that in our current food paradigm. And you have farmers and ranchers in particular that operate on average at 1.5% margins. Like that is the national average. And so they are one disaster away from losing their farm. And they are existing in isolation with a huge burden of producing food and a lot of negative press. And I think that they could use a hand or support. And so I would love to see that be one of the first questions we ask our farmers and ranchers outside of all of those questions about how they raise their food. Ask about them. Not that I don't think that the latter is important too.
Yeah. Yeah. So for you as a farmer, as a rancher, how can people support you?
Gosh, you know, we would love if people in our community occasionally came together and helped to put up hay to help us do jobs that are too big for just the two of us. Even if they were just giving, an hour of their time. And I think to be seen, like, oh, I see you out here every day working, and just I see that you're doing that. And I imagine it probably feels hard. Like, I think just those two things would go a very long way.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think we realize, as me being a non farmer, we don't realize the work that goes into farming and the importance of
Yeah.
farming.
Yeah.
There's a sticker on a vehicle that I see all the time that says, like, you have to thank your farmers for beer,
Mhm.
and it's something that you don't think about. Like, farming contributes to so many things
Yeah.
that
And
are necessary.
all the hands that touch our food, right? Because I think underneath the layer of just your farmers and ranchers that might own a piece of property are all the farm workers that pick our food, that do incredible amounts of labor for our food. And we are dependent on to have beer, to have strawberries, to have these things that we take for granted. And in some ways, I'm really interested in exploring not just the health element of asking this, is it grass fed or is it regeneratively raised, but to explore also the human element of how we can support humans in a system that isn't functioning very well.
Yeah. Yeah. That supporting humans in a system that isn't functioning very well. What that feels like for me is that interconnectedness, coming back to that, where you're not isolated, working the fields on your own, like that community aspect
Yeah.
coming back. Yeah.
Yeah.
You spoke to death, which is completely different to what we were just speaking to, but death being part of your journey, this
Yeah.
fear of death in your childhood, in the beginning, so to speak. What does your relationship to death look like now?
I think in many ways, what began in childhood as a fear and also a morbid curiosity of death, right? this sounds quite morbid, but as a 4-year-old, I would watch the scene where Bambi's mother gets shot over and over and over again, just trying to understand this thing, and was really drawn to it, and was also incredibly fearful of it. And so I had this really a lot of tension in that relationship. And I think that this isn't uncommon. We don't see death in our culture in the way that we might have when we were hunting food. We would have had a consistent view of death, and death would have been a part of our community. It wouldn't have been hidden in hospice or in hospitals. It would have been a fact. We would have cared for and undertaken our dead, and actually did up until about 150 years ago. And so we've really obfuscated and removed death. And I think that you even see this in our ideas of our economic system, in the idea of our resources on earth, that there is growth in perpetuity, that there is unlimited amounts, and that speaks to a culture that has forgotten about the importance of death and decay as part of the cycle. And so I think that a lot of us have this tense relationship with death. And it's something that I really went into, I think, in those, especially in those early years of switching from being a vegetarian to being a butcher. I wanted to see my food die. And maybe that sounds kind of harsh and kind of morbid, but I felt that to participate in this system, and I am unequivocally a participator. I'm not an observer, and I am participating whether I am doing so actively or not, even if it is passive participation, that I wanted to be able to hold that piece of seeing death. And I think that that deepened over the years into wanting to be the one that brought that death to the animal, and to explore my own relationship with that descent, and with that facing of my own mortality, my own fears for the ways that death is grief, that death is loss, and that it also speaks of the deep love and joy that we are capable of cultivating. And the more I go into this work, the more that's what I find, that, there's a William Blake poem, and joy and grief are woven together in this silken twine, right? We need both. That our grief for loss speaks to the depth of the love that we are capable of. And this has continued for me to explore on the podcast. We just explored home funerals. We're going to be exploring more avenues of what it means to grieve, both for death, but also death of parts of ourselves, or death of biodiversity in the 6th mass extinction event, and to really touch that, because I think that we're all experiencing a sort of hollowness or an emptiness that we can't put our finger on. And I think oftentimes that thing is grief.
Yeah. Yeah. You spoke to how anciently our ancestors took care of the dead.
Yeah.
And can you speak to that a little bit more? Is that like funerals in our homes? Is that what that looked like? Kind of, I was in India quite a few years ago, and, they would have the parade with the dead, their ancestor, that had just died. They would take it through the alleyways and then to the fires along the Ganges. And there was something so ceremonial about all of it, where the dead was with them for quite some time.
Yeah.
Where how we treat the dead is quite a bit different.
Yeah. Some historical context here too, especially, and I want to speak to that. This is strictly in the Western world, and mostly in the United States, actually, that death is viewed differently in other places. But we don't really see death, and death would have been a part of our communities for time immemorial, right? Like we all die, and we would have wanted to care for our dead with the utmost of care, to wash their bodies, to touch them, to be with them in the hours and a couple of days following their death in order to celebrate them, to form a new relationship with them, right? Like death is not the end of our relationship with people. It is the beginning of a new iteration of relationship, and to see them into whatever our beliefs are about the afterlife. And this began to shift, especially after the Civil War in the United States, with the advent of embalming. We embalmed a lot of the soldiers and sent them home. And then Abraham Lincoln died and went on a tour. His embalmed body went on a tour across the United States, and embalming became in vogue. And as we moved into cities, we hired undertakers and funeral homes to do the work that families had done forever, literally since the beginning of human time. We call it a living room because that's where the living gathered. But in the parlor, that is where we held wakes for our dead. And the undertaker generally would maybe just provide you with a coffin, and you did all the other work that we now associate with undertaking. And so this has been a connection throughout all of human history, and we find these burial sites and can imagine some of the rituals that went with them, right? That you so beautifully spoke of, that there would have been these rituals to ease their passing into whatever comes next, and to ease our grief into that transformation, and to provide us a space for community to come together and to hold one another in that space of grief. And now we have something that has been greatly divorced from, I think, both ritual and that connection. There's a beautiful film called In the Parlor with Heidi Boucher, who's been on my podcast as well. She's a home funeral arranger. And and it is a lot of different ways that we can begin to take that back. And I think that there's this idea that we can't have our dead in our homes, right? And it's actually not true. Like, you can still throw a wake, you can wash the body, you can build a coffin, you can transport bodies yourself. And this might all sound very morbid, or might have some reactivity around it. And I do want to leave an invitation here that that's totally okay. That I think that is a perfectly normal response on hearing this.
It's something that we don't even think about. And when you were speaking to that, I remember when I was probably about 15, I grew up in a small town very far north Canada that was surrounded by reservations. So a lot of Indigenous people, and one of our Indigenous friends died tragically, and they had his coffin in their home in this Indigenous land for probably a week before his funeral. And we all went, and it was so beautiful, but it's not something that we think about, or I even thought about until you were just speaking to it, that it.
We pass down these things intergenerationally, right? Like, we pass down our traditions. And one of the things I've come to see is that they're very fragile, right? That just one generation, 2 generations removed from this, we have lost it completely, that it is out of sight and out of mind and out of touch. And so these are things that I think we have to hold with the utmost of preciousness and sacredness, and also have to bravely go into recreating for ourselves and for future generations.
Yeah. Where do you think we go after we die?
I don't know. I think one of the most beautiful things that anybody ever said on the podcast was this woman, Tara Couture, described death as an expansion. And one of the ways that I think a lot about death is through that idea of nutrient cycling that we've kind of talked about and touched on in this podcast, that you have these rocks that are, flung forth from this indescribable universal event, And all of the elements that make up our bodies come forth in that moment. And then fungi liberate those minerals and put them into plants that animals then eat, that then become a part of us. And we are a part of all of these different cycles and beings that have been throughout time and just the matter that makes up our bodies. And then we die, and that matter returns to these deep geological and universal and I think sort of spiritual cycles. And so we are just borrowed matter on borrowed time. And so I think that it is an expansion in that what we perceive as one, right? One autopoietic system, this boundary of self-creation that we are capable of when we are alive, when that ceases, we really return to the many, that all of the microbes that outnumber our own cells 10 to 1 begin to consume us where they supported us. And all of those minerals and elements that make up our bodies return to the soil, return to plant life, return to animal life. And I think that even if it's just that, and I'm not sure that it is just that, that even that would be a beautiful thing. And that feels certain and tangible to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's something deep in the unknown as
Yeah.
well that we'll never fully know until we
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until we
Yeah.
know. And I think that to hold that unknown mystery,
Mm.
I think that that's a juicy part of life.
Yeah. Yeah. When you spoke to the sixth mass extinction, can you just kind of speak to what that is? It's like we all know it's
Yeah.
happening, but it's so far removed from so many of our worlds.
Hmm.
If that makes sense, where it's like, what is the sixth mass
Yeah.
extinction?
I
Is it
mean,
us?
so the sixth mass extinction event, and I don't know how somebody with a bit more experience might define this, but this is the massive loss of biodiversity that we find ourselves in. That we are seeing species of insects, of bacteria, of bigger fauna and animals go extinct at an alarming and very fast rate. And this is happening in what we call the Anthropocene, this epoch of humans that have terraformed Earth in search of food in many ways. And I think that, again, you have a constellation of factors. You have an Earth that undergoes its own climate cycles, and then you have humans that have changed those climate cycles, and those climate cycles are also just changing. And so this is an event where we are seeing a massive loss of biodiversity. And it's what there's a beautiful philosopher named Timothy Morton would call a hyper object, that it has a finitude, but that it is so massive that we can't see it or really feel it, but we know that it's occurring. And so the sixth mass extinction would be a hyper object, and it's a pretty hard thing to sort of touch or define. And I actually think that there is, though, this sort of collective experience of feeling maybe a sense of grief or a sense of something occurring that is greater than ourselves. And here we are right here in this now, this timeline, experiencing that thing. And not the first time that it's happened throughout the history of Earth either. And I think that's important to recognize. And oftentimes these mass extinction events give way to the blossoming of even more biodiversity than we ever imagined through this sort of death and decay.
Yeah. That brought me back to the beginning of our conversation where you spoke about those deep descents being a jumping off point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're experiencing that, this jumping
Mm-hmm.
off point right
Yeah.
now on the planet, where it's like, how can I find that connection for myself to the earth?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know where this came from, but somebody speaks so beautifully to it about just get yourself a piece of soil, like a, you know, get your hands in some soil and you'll start to feel that connection. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I had quite a severe health crisis over Christmas that I'm still recovering from. And in that, my friend sold me her worm farm. And so
Beautiful.
I
Oh,
have
tell
this
me more.
worm farm on my deck
Yeah.
because I live in a townhouse right on the ocean. And I'm obsessed with these worms. And it's so cool to see how these, because
Mm.
they're composting worms,
Yeah.
break everything down. And it's like just connecting to something so um, like in my face, like visceral, I think is the
Mm-hmm.
word I'm looking for,
Mm-hmm.
and connected to the earth just deepens that connection where you want to learn more about it. And now I'm getting bees next week, and I've been harvesting wild roses all week,
Mm.
and that deep connection. And it started with a health crisis,
Yeah.
you know, kind of a jumping off point.
It
And
it often starts in the descent, right? Into the descent into the unknown, into these big and difficult things. And I think to use the earthworm, here you have this beautiful metaphor for decomposition, that an earthworm can take the constituent components of something and turn it into something else, to transform it into something even more fertile, right? And I think that we are in that space of transformation where there is a lot of potential. There is a lot of possibility in the same way that you see in your worm farm every day as they transform matter into fertility. And that is part of, I mean, they earthworms in the soil, right? They break down rocks and liberate some of these minerals for the mineral cycle. And their castings become some of the most nutrient dense material for growth. And I think that we can find a lot of ourselves in these metaphors of descent, and in that act of going outside and grabbing just a handful of soil and marveling at the idea that it contains billions of microorganisms, that it contains tens of billions of viruses. And so there are more viruses in that handful of soil than there probably are stars in the sky. And so what does that say about descent?
yeah, yeah, we can learn so much from worms and
Mm-hmm.
from bees and just all
Mm-hmm.
from nature about how to
Yeah.
live in a
Yeah.
really
And
beautiful way.
and we are nature, right?
Yeah.
One of the fathers of quantum physics, Werner Heisenberg, said we cannot speak of nature without also speaking of ourselves, right? We are inextricably linked to this thing. It is not outside us, it is inside and a part of and interpenetrating us at all
Mm.
times, and us with that.
Yeah, we can't forget that. And that's part of our journey to reconnection.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah, yeah. What's been your biggest lesson along the way?
I think my biggest lesson has been this lesson about connecting. And I think it's a lesson I'm constantly learning in different ways, right? Like, I don't think I'm finished learning this lesson of connection. And I think coming from a very disconnected space in childhood and seeking that out, I keep peeling back new layers of what it means to connect. I know that this year, I want more in person connection, I want more community. And so my biggest lesson is connection, and it is an ongoing and lifelong lesson.
Yeah. I saw a meme that said the new, what was it? The new way to live life. I can't think of the word right now. was offline.
Yeah.
And it's
Yes.
so true. I know for myself, I spent years building an online business, and now I spend more than half of it offline.
Yes.
And that's where connection and healing really
happen
for
Yeah.
sure.
And I think that, I think that our loss for the village, right, for the band of people that we once lived with for most of human history is profound, that we no longer have that. And I think that in many ways, it's at the core of a lot of problems that we face as a society, that you can trace it back to this loss of the village. And I think that we feel like the village might be in those apps. I know that I feel this way sometimes, right? And one of the things I've been asking myself lately when I pick up my phone to scroll through Instagram is why? What are you looking for? And usually it's one of two things. Usually I'm looking for connection, this idea of connection. And I think that it's a parasocial relationship, right? Like it's not a true connection. And which isn't to say that I haven't met a lot of incredible people through these apps. Or I'm looking to avoid a sense of grief that I feel in my own life. And 9 times out of 10, it's one of those two things. And so I think that move to build the communities that we long for, that we ache for, I think that's the work right now.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you experience the mysteries?
I think I experience the mysteries by becoming aware of the mysteries and becoming aware of the wonder. I think it is a return to a childlike state of awe and of continuity whenever I can, to play with the magic that is a part of every single day if we just pause and look around and get curious. And if you can find in yourself the child that just wants to ask why, and when you find the answer, to ask why again, until pretty soon you have run into a riddle, a paradox, or a mystery. I think that is what we can do. And I think that sense of play too connects us. And I think that it brings in levity too. Much of this conversation have been things that we perceive as heavy or as dark, but I really want to leave people with a sense of that so much of this can be playful and can be driven by curiosity, and that we can harness that in just becoming like an animal or a child, and being in awe of a dandelion, or playing in the water, whatever form that takes.
Yeah, I listened to the episode of With You and Your Beloved, your husband, and you spoke a lot about play and how important it is. And I think in that like speeding up of life that we've all gone through over, we lost play.
Yes.
Like I don't have time to do that. Like this past week, I've been like so in awe of myself to give myself permission to spend hours harvesting wild roses, like looking for them and pick. And I was like, 10 years ago, I would have been like, this is a complete waste of your time. But that feels like frolicking. It's literally frolicking in the forest.
Yeah. You're playing with nature. You're playing with yourself. You're playing in this massive playground and enjoying and engaging your senses. What a beautiful space to confer healing to yourself too, in that space of play and in praise of wasting time, as Alan Lightman says. There's so much of our life. My friend James Connolly recently pointed out to me that so much of what we do is couched in the idea of efficiency and productivity. And I'm more curious about boredom and wasting time and play. How can I create more space in my life, not to make or create or do, but to be and to be,
It
to
feels like
play,
that
and to find
connectedness.
creativity, not as much creation as just creation for the sake of creation,
Yeah.
not with an end goal in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And with your beloved, what have been some of the key factors into creating a beautiful union?
I think to be vulnerable, right? To expose the tenderness of that inner child, to allow somebody to see the machinations of our brain as much as anybody can, and to be open to that, to be open to what comes of that. I think that that's been one of the biggest pieces, to share those parts of ourselves that we want to keep hidden because we are ashamed or afraid, and to bring them to the surface, to heal and to share with another in relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. That brought me to even like sharing on a podcast, our really dark
Yes.
moments. I've been sitting with sharing this last health crisis because it was around mental health, and
Mm,
so much comes up around sharing it, and then I always come back to the point of we don't talk about these things
yeah.
enough, and when we don't talk about them, there's shame,
Yes.
shame associated with them, and that it's wrong. And so the more that we open up, just even in relationship with our beloveds or with our families or on a podcast,
Yeah.
the shame goes away, where it's like you can say it's okay to not be okay, or it's
Yeah.
okay to grieve and feel
Mm.
these things that are often hidden in our
Mm.
society.
Yeah. And to allow that shame to be transformed, right?
Yeah, yeah. When you share it, it
Yeah.
alchemizes into something really beautiful,
Yeah.
as
But when you
opposed to
keep
that,
it
like,
in,
yeah, that
you keep it in,
rotting.
it festers, right? And I think that this is part of isolation.
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
isolation and shame and withdrawing, and so much of what happens for healing is what happens in relationship with everything else, right?
yeah.
Like that sense of self comes from the idea of being able to touch another. Like I only know that I am myself as much
Mm,
of that I can touch another, or take in food, and those constituent components become me. And so I think so much of this has to happen in relationship. I'm glad that you're sharing about that. I think it's really important. I've talked a lot about my mental health journey and some of those points of
mm,
darkness and shame. And there is something freeing and transformative about sharing those spaces.
yeah. It's ultimately healing
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
end for
But it's
ourselves, but for so many others.
also courageous, and I want
Oh
to
yeah.
I want to see that in you too. That
Yeah,
it
yeah.
it takes courage to be vulnerable. It is not an
Mhm.
easy thing. It is a brave thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Last question, love. How do you root into the self?
Hmm. I think so much of it is what I just said, right? I've been thinking a lot about this boundary of self and other.
Mm,
If 9 out of every 10 of our cells are members of our microbiome, are bacteria and parasites and fungi, then so much of what I call myself is actually other. And I think that the only way that I can know that I am a self is when I look out on the land and I see beauty reflected back to me
mm,
of all these others that exist in my immediate vicinity.
mm.
That when I reach out to touch something, that there is something on the other side of me that is being felt. And so I think a rooting into self is actually a rooting into relationship.
I love that. That's been like the overlying umbrella of our whole conversation.
I like a theme.
Yeah, yeah. But it's like, I don't know if I saw it on your Instagram or somewhere, but probably on one of your episodes, but touching the goat, it becomes
Yeah.
part of your makeup as well. And we don't think about that. Like,
when I go out and I
everything.
milk my goat, her microbes become mine. And then I drink her milk and parts of her become me. And then I go and I scratch her and parts of my microbiome become her, right? There is this literal reciprocity, this literal transformation that is happening as we exist in relationship with other things, that every breath, right? We breathe in bacteria in the air that then populate our digestive tract, and every breath out of carbon dioxide becomes a part of plant tissues, and they in return give us oxygen, right? There's just this constant shifting of self into other, into self again, to where it becomes a sort of blurry middle space that is really beautiful to me.
Yeah. Is there anything that you want to add before we close to this conversation?
No, this was a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for creating this container for it to unfold. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Yes, I loved this conversation. It felt like a beautiful web and tapestry woven co-creation for sure, which is beautiful.
I agree.
Yeah. Where can everybody find you?
You can find me on the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. You can also find me on Instagram at Kate, Kate _ Kavanaugh, Kavanaughh. And I'm sure we'll have links to website in the show notes. But those are the two places that are best to find me.
Okay, beautiful. And your Patreon and your sub
Thank
stack.
you. Yes. I do have a Substack where some of my writing lives, and a Patreon if you would like to support the podcast in reciprocity with me. Thank you for that prompt.
Yeah. Yes, there'll be links and everything in the show notes. So thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much for joining me for an episode of the Phoenix Rising podcast. Please like, share, download, subscribe if you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week for another episode on the Phoenix Rising podcast. Sending so much love.